calmcriminal. On a winter day in 1978, a young man walked out onto the frozen edge of Lake Michigan and simply ceased to belong to the world the rest of us know. His skis were left behind, his footprints carried on over the snow and the ice, and then, with a kind of quiet that feels almost obscene, the trail stopped. No body broke the surface, no second set of tracks appeared, no answer ever arrived. And then, more than a year later, Stephen Kubacki came back. Stephen Kubacki was 23 years old when he vanished, a student from Hope College in Holland, Michigan, a place not far from the vast and temperamental shoreline of Lake Michigan. That matters because Lake Michigan in winter is not merely scenic, it is severe. It is white, windburned, deceptive, and ancient in temperament. People speak about the Great Lakes as if they are lakes because the word sounds manageable. But anyone who has stood before them in the cold knows better. They behave like inland seas. They swallow light, they swallow sound, and every now and then they seem to swallow people in ways that do not make ordinary sense. Stephen went missing near Saugatuck in February of 1978, and from the first hours of the search there was something wrong with the shape of the story. His abandoned skis, poles, and backpack were found near the shoreline, and beyond them investigators found a long line of footprints, roughly 200 yards in the snow, leading out towards a frozen lake. Then the prints ended abruptly. They did not curve back. They did not scatter in panic. They did not continue on the other side. They just stopped. That single detail is what has kept this case alive for decades, because footprints are supposed to tell a story. They are among the most humble forms of evidence, but also among the most intimate. A footprint is movement made visible. It is proof that a person was here, that a body pressed its weight into the world, that direction and intention existed for one more step. So when tracks simply terminate at the edge of ice and open water, the mind strains against it. In a conventional tragedy, you expect at least some rough physical explanation. Cracked ice, signs of a fall, drag marks, debris, a body recovered later in thaw, something. But here, there was only absence. The obvious conclusion at the time was drowning, because what else could authorities do with a frozen shoreline and a missing young man whose trail went toward the lake? Yet even that explanation has always had a curious incompleteness to it. The image the case leaves behind is not of someone slipping beneath the ice and in a chaotic instant. It is of someone walking toward a blank horizon and vanishing from the grammar of ordinary life. The location adds its own layer of unease. That stretch of Lake Michigan has long been folded into stories about the so-called Lake Michigan Triangle, a region bounded in folklore by points around Ludington, Benton Harbor, and Manitowoc. People have, over the years, attached to those waters the same kind of nervous mythology that clings to the Bermuda Triangle. Disappearances, strange lights, lost vessels, missing aircraft, and the persistent suspicion that certain places on Earth do not behave properly. I am not saying that folklore is evidence in the strictest legal sense, but I am saying that certain landscapes gather stories because human beings keep colliding with the same incomprehensible feeling there. Anyone can dismiss one tale. It becomes harder to dismiss the atmosphere created by many. Stephen Kubacki's disappearance slid so neatly into that geography of dread that it felt less like an isolated incident than a new chapter in an older pattern. Searchers looked for him. Of course they did. A young man does not vanish on a winter shoreline without people trying to pull him back from oblivion. Yet no trace of Stephen was recovered in the way one would expect if the lake had simply claimed him. He was gone long enough that the machinery of ordinary life began to harden around his absence. He was presumed dead. His disappearance moved from emergency into mystery, and from mystery into the strange administrative stillness that descends when authorities can do no more. There is something especially chilling about that stage in a disappearance. The world does not exactly forget you, but it begins to make practical adjustments to the fact that you are no longer in it. People speak your name in the past tense. They sort their memories. They begin grieving someone they cannot bury. Stephen Kubacki, by all appearances, had stepped into that state. He was no longer expected to return. And then the impossible part arrived. 15 months after Stephen vanished from Lake Michigan on May 5th, 1979, he reappeared hundreds of miles away in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. That bare sentence is already unnerving enough, but the details make it feel positively unreal. Stephen later said he woke up lying in a field with no memory of the missing time. The last thing he recalled was being near the lake in Michigan. Then, as far as his conscious mind was concerned, the next moment was waking in Massachusetts. No transition, no journey, no memory of travel, no recollection of where he had been or who he had been with. It was as if a section of his existence had been excised and stitched over, leaving the body intact and the mind staring at a tear in time. He was not, however, found in the same condition in which he had disappeared. That is where the case begins to take on the atmosphere of true missing time, the sort of thing that sits at the crossroads of paranormal accounts, fugue state mysteries, and encounters people later describe in tones of embarrassment because they know how it sounds. Stephen was wearing different clothes. He had a backpack containing maps. Reports describe items near him that suggested movement, travel, and a life lived during the vanished months, even though he himself had no conscious access to any of it. He is also often associated with a T-shirt from a Wisconsin marathon and the deeply peculiar statement that he felt as though he had done a great deal of running. That line has always fascinated me, because it has the texture of bodily memory without narrative memory. The body seemed to remember exertion, distance, momentum, while the mind could produce no ordinary story to account for it. That distinction matters because one of the most unsettling elements in cases of missing time is the split between what the body carries and what the mind can retrieve. Human beings like to imagine memory as a single, neat ledger, but it is not. The body remembers in fragments, in sensations, in muscle, in exhausted impressions, in sudden dread, with no visible source. When Stephen reportedly woke up in Massachusetts and felt as though he had been running, that detail did not sound to me like embellishment. It sounded like something far stranger, the residue of an ordeal his conscious mind was not permitted to keep. It is the kind of detail that appears again and again in stories of unexplained absence. Someone returns changed, burdened by a physical aftertaste of events that remain sealed off, as if whatever happened existed just beyond the range of ordinary recall. And then there is the geography of it. Pittsfield, Massachusetts, is not around the corner. It is not some nearby town where a confused man might reasonably drift unnoticed after a bad episode. It is roughly 700 miles from where Stephen vanished. That distance is not just a logistical inconvenience for rational explanations. It is part of the emotional architecture of the case. He did not merely reappear. He reappeared displaced, as though whatever had taken hold of him had carried him bodily across a vast section of the United States and set him down in a field when it was finished. If you are going to treat this case as a true mystery, and I do, then you have to let that distance breathe for a moment. You have to imagine the cold shore of Lake Michigan in 1978. Then imagine waking in Massachusetts in 1979 with no bridge between the two. That is not ordinary disappearance. That is rupture. There was, according to later reporting, even a man who came forward after Stephen's reappearance made headlines, saying he had picked up a hitchhiker on the same day Stephen resurfaced, and that the hitchhiker bore a remarkable resemblance to him. The figure reportedly called himself Nathan, and allegedly spoke of having flown from San Francisco to Boston before taking a bus to Pittsfield. I do not cling to that account as the central pillar of the story, because it enters from the edge like many witness recollections do, but it is precisely the kind of side detail that makes the case feel haunted rather than merely odd. A missing man reappears with no memory, and on the same day another man possibly sees a version of him moving through the country under another name. That is the sort of thing that does not explain a mystery. It deepens it. It creates the dreadful possibility that Stephen Kubacki's missing time was not empty at all, but inhabited by another self, another pattern of movement, another life walking around behind a locked door in his mind. When people hear stories like this, they often rush to choose a category because categories are comforting. They want it to be crime, or illness, or hoax, or mental fugue, or spiritual encounter, or abduction. They want the world sorted. But Stephen Kubacki's case resists sorting precisely because the core facts are so stubbornly dreamlike. A young man vanishes at a frozen lake after leaving behind gear and a finite line of tracks. He is presumed dead. More than a year later, he wakes in another state, with no memory of the missing months, carrying traces of a life he cannot consciously reach. That is the skeleton of the case, and the skeleton is strong enough on its own. You do not need to smother it in melodrama. The horror is in its quietness, in how little noise the impossible made when it happened. If you ask me what makes this story feel genuinely paranormal, it is not merely the missing time, though that would be enough. It is the combination of missing time with a physical trail that ends where it should not end. There are cases of amnesia. There are cases of dissociation. There are cases of people wandering and later returning with fractured memory. But a trail of footprints ending on the ice beside one of the most myth-haunted lakes in America, followed by a reappearance 700 miles away, with no ordinary bridge between those two states of being, has the structure of something else. It has the structure of an intervention, of crossing, of removal. It feels, frankly, as though Stephen Kubacki stepped into the wrong place at the wrong moment and was taken somewhere human language is badly equipped to describe. That is where I want to begin this story, because the lake is not merely the backdrop. The lake is the threshold. the frozen shoreline, the abandoned equipment, the tracks pressed into winter, and then abruptly denied continuation. All of it creates the sensation that Stephen did not just disappear near Lake Michigan, he disappeared through it, or beside it, or with its cooperation. And when he came back, he did not come back with an explanation. He came back with the one thing more disturbing than a corpse in the water. A living body carrying a blank space where 15 months of reality should have been. When Stephen Kubacki came back into the world, he did not return as someone rescued from an ordeal. He returned as someone displaced from one. That distinction matters, because there is no sense in this case that he fought his way out of anything, or that he understood what had happened to him. He woke in a field near Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and the experience, as he described it, had the quality of interruption rather than survival. It was as though something had been happening elsewhere, out of reach of his awareness, and then suddenly ceased, depositing him back into ordinary reality without explanation or ceremony. The first thing to understand about that moment is how profoundly wrong it must have felt. The human mind relies on continuity. Even the strangest days have a thread that connects 1 hour to the next. Stephen's thread had been cut, and when it resumed, it did so in a completely different place, with no sense of the passage in between. He was not discovered wandering in distress or calling for help. He simply found himself there, conscious again, as though waking from a sleep that had not contained dreams. Around him were objects that implied a journey he could not remember making. The backpack found nearby contained maps, and there were indications he had been moving across distances, navigating, existing in the world in a practical, grounded way. That is one of the most unsettling features of the entire case. This was not a situation where a man vanished and remained inert somewhere, hidden or incapacitated. Everything about the physical evidence suggests that Stephen had been active during those 15 months. He had moved, planned routes, worn through time, and yet his mind retained none of it. It is the difference between absence and erasure is far more difficult to accept. The clothing alone tells its own quiet story. He was not wearing what he had on the day he disappeared. Time had passed across his body in measurable ways. His hair had grown. His beard had changed. These are not dramatic details, but they are the sort that anchor a mystery in the physical world. They confirm that whatever happened to him was not instantaneous in the way it felt to his mind. 15 months had left their mark, just not in a way he could consciously access. It is one thing to say a man lost time. It is another to see the evidence of that time etched into him while his memory stands empty. Then there are the fragments, the impressions that lingered without forming a coherent narrative. Stephen spoke at various points about having the sense that he had been somewhere warm, somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere that did not resemble the winter shoreline where he had last been conscious. That detail, small as it may seem, disrupts the expected logic of the case. If this were merely a matter of wandering through the American Midwest in a dissociated state, one would expect a continuity of environment, a gradual transition from cold to mild, from one region to another. Instead, what we are left with is a man who steps out into the frozen edge of Lake Michigan and later carries the impression of warmth. as though he had been removed from that season entirely. It suggests not just distance, but dislocation. There is also the matter of physical conditioning. Reports that he felt as though he had been running or exerting himself over long distances give the case a strange kinetic undercurrent. It is as though his body had been engaged in sustained movement, effort, perhaps even stress, while his conscious mind was absent from the experience. That creates a deeply uncomfortable image. You are left to imagine a version of Stephen Kubacki moving through landscapes, interacting with the world, making decisions, all while the part of him that would later remember it had been sealed off. The body went on, the life went on, the awareness did not. It is here that the case begins to brush against other accounts of missing time that refuse to sit comfortably within medical or psychological frameworks alone. There are stories scattered across decades and continents of individuals who report gaps in their lives that cannot be reconciled with ordinary chronology. They speak of hours that feel like minutes, of journeys that leave no memory, of returning with fragments that do not assemble into a whole. In many of those cases, there is also a peculiar sense of having been elsewhere, not just geographically, but fundamentally. Stephen's account fits that pattern in a way that is difficult to ignore. He did not simply forget. He was absent from his own continuity. The hitchhiker account, though peripheral, takes on a different tone when viewed through that lens. A man resembling Stephen, using another name, moving with apparent purpose across the country, suggests the possibility that the missing time was not a void at all, but a period inhabited by another identity, or another layer of self that operated independently of the one that later returned. If that is the case, then the question becomes far more complex than where Stephen was. It becomes who he was during that time, and why that version of him left no accessible trace behind. The idea that a person could live an entire stretch of life and then have it removed from their awareness is not merely unsettling. It challenges the basic assumption that identity is continuous and singular. There is a tendency to reach for dissociative fugue as a framework here, and certainly, on the surface, it offers a structure that appears to fit. A person loses the sense of identity, travels, assumes a different existence, and later returns with no memory of the period. But even within that framework, Stephen's case resists neat categorization. The conditions required for such an extended fugue, combined with the geographic displacement, the physical evidence of sustained activity, and the complete absence of a recoverable narrative, push the boundaries of what is typically observed. It is not that the explanation is impossible, it is that it feels insufficient, like a label applied to something that extends beyond its usual limits. What continues to draw attention, even decades later, is the symmetry of the disappearance and the reappearance. In 1978, Stephen walks toward a body of water known for its depth, its cold, its capacity to conceal, and he vanishes at the precise point where the physical trail should have continued. In 1979, he re-enters the world not gradually, not through discovery or rescue, but abruptly, in a field, with no bridge between those two states. It is as though the event had two clean edges, an entry and an exit, both equally devoid of explanation. That kind of symmetry is rare in ordinary cases. It has the feel of something contained, as if whatever happened to him had a beginning and an end that were sharply defined, even if the interior remains completely inaccessible. And then there is the silence of the missing months. No confirmed sightings that can be tied definitively to him. No records that clearly map his movements. No narrative that can be reconstructed through external evidence. If Stephen Kubacki was moving through the world during that time, as the physical clues suggest, then he did so in a way that left remarkably little trace. That absence of trace is not, in itself, proof of anything beyond the limits of record keeping, but in the context of this case, it contributes to the overall sense that the missing time exists in a kind of sealed compartment, inaccessible from both directions. He cannot remember it from within, and we cannot observe it from without. When you hold all of these details together, the case begins to feel less like a problem to be solved, and more like a boundary to be acknowledged. There is a point beyond which the available facts no longer behave in ways that allow for comfortable interpretation. The footprints that end at the ice, the body that reappears hundreds of miles away, the months that pass and leave their mark physically but not mentally, the faint impressions of warmth, of movement, of a life lived out of reach. Each element on its own might be folded into an ordinary explanation with enough effort. Together, they resist that folding. They remain slightly out of alignment with the explanations we prefer. What I find most compelling is not a single detail, but the consistency of the strangeness across every stage of the story. There is no moment where the case settles into something familiar. It begins with a disappearance that defies the usual patterns, and it ends with a return that does the same. In between, there is nothing but silence. That silence is not empty. It feels occupied, as though something happened there that has simply not been made available to us, or to Stephen himself. By the time he resumed his life, the world had already decided he was gone. He stepped back into it, carrying a gap that could not be filled, and for the rest of his life, that gap remained. Not as a story he could tell, but as an absence he could not escape. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Not that he disappeared, and not even that he returned, but that whatever happened in those 15 months remained intact somewhere, complete and real, and entirely beyond reach. There is a point, if you sit with this case long enough, where the ordinary explanations stop feeling like explanations at all, and start sounding like ways to look away from what is actually being suggested. Because if you take the details seriously, not selectively, but as a whole, then what happened to Stephen Kubacki begins to resemble not an accident, not a fugue, but an interruption by something that does not operate according to the same rules we do. You have a defined entry point, a defined exit point, and in between, a sealed interval that behaves like it belongs to a different system entirely. And the place where it begins is not random. It is a frozen shoreline in a region that has accumulated stories of disappearance and distortion for longer than most people realize. Lake Michigan in winter is not just a body of water, it becomes something else. The ice shifts, the wind strips away sound, the horizon flattens into something almost abstract, and the usual markers of distance and depth begin to fail. People who have spent time near those shores in deep winter often describe a sense of disorientation that arrives quietly, as if the environment is subtly rearranging your perception without asking permission. There are long-standing accounts, not just modern ones, of strange lights over the lake, of objects seen moving beneath the surface where nothing should be, of vessels that fail to arrive, of aircraft that vanish from radar without a trace. None of these stories prove anything in isolation, but taken together, they form a pattern of unease that is difficult to dismiss entirely. When Stephen's footprints led out onto that ice and then stopped, it did not feel like he had reached the end of something. It felt like he had reached a boundary. And boundaries in stories like this are rarely physical in the way we expect. They are thresholds, points where one set of conditions gives way to another, often without any visible transition. The ice is perfect for that because it is neither land nor water in any stable sense. It is a temporary surface, a skin stretched over something deep and moving and unseen. To walk out onto it is, in a way, to walk between states, solid and liquid, safe and unsafe, known and unknown. If there is anywhere in that landscape where something could occur that slips past ordinary explanation, it would be there, on that shifting edge. What if Stephen did not fall through the ice, but through something else entirely? What if the end of those footprints marks not a physical accident, but a point of transfer? The idea is uncomfortable because it forces you to consider that a person could be removed from one reality and placed into another without any visible mechanism. But look at the structure of the case again. He vanishes at a threshold. He reappears at another, in a field, another open space, another place where the world feels briefly uncontained. And in between, he carries the physical evidence of time having passed, but none of the memory. That is not how drowning works. That is not how ordinary disappearance works. That is how removal works. The fragments he does retain begin to matter more when you look at them this way. The sense of warmth, the feeling of sustained movement, the absence of cold in what should have been a winter-bound experience. It suggests an environment completely detached from the one he left. Not just geographically different, but fundamentally altered. Warmer, perhaps enclosed, perhaps structured in a way that required him to move, to run, to expend energy over long periods. And yet, no memory of the purpose of that movement, no recollection of why he was there or what he was doing, only the residue, the physical echo of activity without narrative. And then there is his silence. That, to me, is one of the most telling aspects of the entire case. People who fabricate stories tend to elaborate. They fill in gaps. They provide details, sometimes too many, because the act of invention requires constant reinforcement. Stephen Kubacki does not do that. He does not offer a dramatic account. He does not attempt to explain the unexplainable. He provides the bare facts as he experienced them and leaves the void intact. Over time, he moved on with his life, pursued an academic career, and, notably, specialized in psychology, including areas related to memory and trauma. That choice alone raises questions. It is the sort of path one might take if one had encountered something within themselves that they could not fully understand. Something that required study rather than storytelling. Why would someone remain so reserved about an experience that has made them the center of one of the strangest disappearance cases on record? One possibility is simple. He truly does not know what happened, and there is nothing to tell. But there is another possibility, one that sits uncomfortably beneath the surface, that he knows more than he has ever said, and that whatever he knows does not translate into language in any clean or reassuring way. There are experiences that resist being spoken, not because they are trivial, but because they are too far outside the shared framework of reality. If Stephen retained even fragments of something like that, it would explain the restraint. Not secrecy in the sense of concealment, but silence in the sense of incompatibility. There is also the question of what might have been done to him during that missing time. The idea that he was simply wandering, living an ordinary parallel life, becomes harder to accept when you consider the total absence of recoverable memory. Even in cases of dissociation, fragments usually surface. Names, places, flashes of recognition. Here, there is almost nothing. It is as though the period was deliberately sealed. That raises the possibility that whatever environment he was in was not neutral. It was controlled, structured, perhaps even observed. The feeling that he had been running could suggest not aimless movement, but directed activity. Movement with purpose, even if that purpose is now inaccessible. There are those who interpret cases like this through the lens of abduction, and while that term carries its own cultural weight, the underlying idea is not as easily dismissed as it might seem. The pattern is familiar: a sudden disappearance, a gap in time, a reappearance with altered clothing and unexplained physical traces, and a complete or near complete absence of memory. What is less often considered is the possibility that such an event would not necessarily leave behind dramatic, cinematic evidence. It might look exactly like this: quiet, incomplete, almost mundane at the surface, until you begin to follow the details and realize that they do not align with any process we understand. And then there is the location again, the lake itself, sitting there as both origin and question mark. Water has always held a particular place in human stories of the unknown. It reflects, it conceals, it distorts. Large bodies of water, especially ones as deep and complex as Lake Michigan, create conditions where perception can fail, and where the boundary between surface and depth becomes psychologically loaded. Add to that the history of unexplained incidents in that region, and you begin to see why Stephen's disappearance does not feel isolated. It feels like a interaction with something that is already there, something that occasionally intersects with human lives in ways that leave us with stories like this. What then happened to him? If you strip away the need for a comfortable answer, the most honest response is that he appears to have been taken out of ordinary continuity, placed somewhere else for a measurable period of time, and then returned. Not returned to the same place, not returned with an explanation, but returned in a way that preserves the fact of the interruption while concealing its nature. The missing time is not empty. It is occupied by something we do not have access to. Whether that something is another environment, another layer of reality, or an intelligence capable of moving a human being across space and time without leaving a trace, we cannot say with certainty. But the structure of the case points in that direction far more strongly than it points toward accident or coincidence. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: if something like that can happen once, without warning, without resistance, then there is no clear reason to believe it cannot happen again. The footprints end, the person is gone, time passes, and somewhere, beyond the reach of memory and record, something occurs. Then, just as abruptly, the person returns, carrying nothing but the faintest impressions of where they have been. Stephen Kubacki stepped out onto the ice in 1978 and, for 15 months, ceased to exist in the way we understand existence. When he came back, he brought with him proof that something had happened, but not the means to explain it. That is where the story settles, not with an answer, but with a shape. A beginning at the edge of a frozen lake, an ending in a quiet field hundreds of miles away, and between them a silence that feels less like absence and more like something waiting, intact and unresolved, just beyond the limits of what we are able to perceive.